We got some audio. Trying to put myself in the middle of the picture here. Zoom.
Some nice posters in the background.
Yeah, all on eBay too. Because Noble Sissle never collected his own stuff.
So how many things are on the wall?
Let's see, that Chesterfield ad. Let's Go Dancing with Noble. That's actually out in Oregon. And then,
do we know who the woman is? Is she a famous woman?
her name is on there, Sheila Guise, Guise. I think she's a model.
Okay.
And he never smoked, but folks have seen this ad in theaters. And I remember seeing it one time, have not been able to get it. He starts off by saying, "My friends down south tell me about the fine tobacco that goes into Chesterfield." I said, he didn't smoke. And that's
some of the baseball players. They just put cigarettes in their mouth. They weren't really smoking, but Ted Williams just has a cigarette superimposed on him.
Right.
Anyway, so I'm going to introduce. Well, this is not part of the program. This will be a race. So starting now,
okay.
I'm going to. Good afternoon. Today, I'm very happy to have Noble Sissle Jr., who is obviously the son of Noble Sissle of Sissle and Blake. Good afternoon, Noble.
Good afternoon, wherever you are. Connecticut, right?
Connecticut, right. And you're
okay.
in Florida. What major town are you near?
I'm actually in Tampa.
Tampa.
And the thing about Florida is you don't go out in the sun. That's the secret. You stay inside with the air conditioning. Even our baseball team has an air-conditioned stadium. So stay out of the sun, but stay in Florida.
Sports teams are doing very well.
Yes, we are. 1-1, game 3 tonight.
I'm unfortunately for you rooting for the Dodgers, but
of course.
There's some connection to
people are still rooting Brooklyn Dodgers, right?
Yes. So let's go through your father's life. I know that he was born 131 years ago, or
that's right.
A year or so of that. He was born in
1889.
Right. In Indiana, in a small town in Indiana?
Actually, Indianapolis.
Ah, okay. And when did he first get involved in music?
Well, let me just back you up. His story is he was conceived in Cleveland, Ohio, and born in Indianapolis because his father was a minister, and he got moved around to various churches until he rose up to a bishop level. And then when he went to Indianapolis, he actually stayed there for years. And then he got assigned to Cleveland. And that's where my dad was in high school. And to make money, he worked in a hotel as a busboy, not as a waiter, but as a busboy. But he sang in the boys' chorus, mixed chorus, in the high school, Central High. And he was known for this great tenor voice. Of course, his father had him singing in church since he was maybe 5 or 6. So he had a little reputation of a singer, even in high school in Cleveland. So while he was doing his duties at the hotel owner and his wife went to New York City, the center of the world, right, for Christmas to catch some shows. And when he came back, he approached my dad. He said, you know, every big swanky hotel in New York has a band playing, an orchestra. I know you sing, but do you think you can get an orchestra for our little hotel here? My dad said in 7 days, he had a 14-piece band playing in the hotel. And
he was playing piano?
Nope, he didn't play anything. He could find middle C, but he never played an instrument. He was a vocalist. And as summers rolled by, he joined other traveling singing groups, and they worked their way through a circuit all the way to New York and back. And so that's how he picked up money in high school.
So when did he get to New York?
Well, after a couple of summers, he went off to college, and his father passed away during this time. So he moved back. Back the family relocated from Cleveland back to Indianapolis, where they still had a home. And so while he was there, he started singing with groups and making a living. And the group worked its way to New York, and they had seasonal gigs up and down the East Coast. Winter, you go to Florida. And so he was with that group, a band, just as a vocalist. And he got a call, I guess in those days it was a wire, that there was a group playing for a couple of performances in Baltimore, and their singer got sick, someone who was kind of well known in the circles. And could he come down to Baltimore? This is 1915, come down and fill in. And he did. He got off the train literally and made his way to where the group was leaving a house, going to this park to play. And as he was walking along with these gentlemen who didn't really know, one of them turned to him and said, "Sissle, I saw your name on a sheet of music somewhere." And my dad said, "Yes, I used to write cheers for our school, but a few other little things." So he says, "Well, my name is UB. I'm a pianist. I'm looking for a lyricist." They shook hands, and that was the beginning of Sissle and Blake in 1915 in Baltimore.
And how long did it take for them to write a song?
Well, he actually stayed in Baltimore for a period of time, and Sophie Tucker was appearing there. So my dad got the bright idea, why don't we go pitch a song to her? Of course, UB, being the pianist that he was, playing the kind of music, ragtime, he said, "I'm not going down there. That lady's going to chase us all out that theater. First of all, they don't want black folks in the theater to begin with." He said, "No, let's go down and pitch a song. I'm sure she's like any other artist looking for a good song." So with another gentleman named Nelson, they put together a real quick song and called It's All Your Fault. UB was not really, he was a composer, but he wasn't, he didn't write orchestrations. So at the last minute, he wrote the piano part of the song that they drew up on a piece of paper with ink. And as they were going down to the theater to really go backstage and see if they could see her, it started to rain. And the ink on the paper started flowing, and UB's trying to remember the song. Dad had the lyrics, UB didn't have the music. So they waited and they waited. And Miss Tucker, the way UB says, she was in the backstage. She's, "Okay, boys, come on in, you got 5 minutes. What do you got? What do you got?" So UB did the best he could to remember what he wrote, and Dad sang it, and she liked it. She says, "Okay, now go back and write it out so we can all read it, and I'll give it to my director." And she put it in her show, and according to them, it became a hit locally in Baltimore. So that was the first song they ever wrote, "It's All Your Fault."
Did she ever record that song?
When Columbia Records did a double album for UB called the 86 Years of UB Blake, the double album release, they brought Dad into the studio and they did a couple of medleys, Shuffle Along and some others, and they did that song and they talked about it. "Hey, sister, remember when we wrote this song?" "Yeah, I'll never forget it." And it's on the Columbia album, them talking about how they brought it to Sophie Tucker.
And what songs or what happened after Sophie?
Well, Dad then had to proceed on with the band that he was originally with, and they went down to Florida. And the band he was with, they played exclusively for high society people in Florida at the big mansions, playing background music, during their events and social activities.
Some
And
dance music? Did people dance?
well, dance music, but pretty much background music. But then my dad was a vocalist, so they always wanted him to sing their popular songs. So he would sing the songs of the hostess on the host, whoever house they were in, hey, can you sing this? And it was usually the standards of the day. This is 1915 going into 1916. And so there was a lady there who was very prominent in New York, and she used to put on these big fundraisers in the Palace Theater in New York. And my dad wanted to meet officially James Reese Europe, who was the most prominent African-American musician in New York at the time. And my dad thought he needed a letter of introduction. So she wrote a letter for him. And then when my dad returned to New York, he went to James Reese Europe's office and introduced himself. And James Reese Europe says, oh, I know about you. I mean, I've heard you sing and everything. And right away, my dad said, because James Reese Europe had what he called the Clef Club, which was really an African-American union of musicians, because the existing unions were not getting African-Americans prime opportunities. They would give them things to play, the Savoy and those kind of places, but not the fine establishments. So Europe put together about 200 members of his organization. And at one point in time, he had 16 orchestras to play around New York for the Vernon and Irene Castles and the Vanderbilts and anybody else who needed fine orchestra music. So my dad got into that as the vocalist. But right away he told Jim, I know you have about 30 piano players, but my partner is great. We've written a couple of songs together. His name is UB Blake. And Europe told him, I've been trying to get UB to come to New York for 10 years, but he will not leave Baltimore because he cares for his mother and father, who were former slaves. And UB was their only source of income. So my dad said, well, I know how to get him up here. So he wired UB and says, come to New York and join me with Jim Europe. He guarantees you a paycheck every week. And within a week, Hubert Blake, UB Blake, moved to New York and sent money back home. So UB comes to New York in 1916 with my dad, and they become a part of James Reese Europe's Clef Club organization.
And when did they start to record?
Well, with Europe, it was all about putting the orchestras out for gigs throughout New York and Long Island, Connecticut, wherever that James Reese Europe name opened doors, that's where those orchestras would go. So come along 1916, America declares war on Germany and start to mobilizing. Well, for 4 or 5 years, African Americans living in Harlem had been trying to get an armory, a National Guard post in Harlem. They didn't have one. Most of your large African American communities, like Chicago, Detroit, they all had existing National Guards. So America got to the point where they said, we're going to put together 2 African American divisions to consider going to Europe when it comes time to mobilize. So when they created the Harlem regiment, it was called the 15th National Guard Regiment. And James Reese Europe thought it was, because there was a debate going on, should African Americans fight in World War I? Civil War had just concluded about 50 years before. Should we go? So there was a long debate about should we go. Jim Europe said we should, because it's also a key to society. Because when it's over, they're going to look at those folks who served, and it might open a few more doors. So James Reese Europe goes down and signed up with the 15th National Guard because he wanted to serve, but he didn't want to serve as a musician. He wanted to serve as a fighter. So he became the leader of the machine gun company of the 15th National Guard Regiment, which automatically made him an officer because of his other credentials. And when he goes back to the office, he said, and Noble, you're going down there and sign up too. My dad says, wait a minute, we got all these plans. We talking about going to fight. I mean, come on, Jim. Nope. we're going to fight. So the same day, my dad went down and signed up for the 15th National Guard. This is 1916. So as America is mobilizing, the National Guard, they don't have an armory, so there's not much to do, but you are in the Army as a reservist, so to speak. So they carry on with their music, but now it's time to mobilize. And they want the 15th National Guard in New York to join the 93rd Division. That was going to be an all-black division. So they were having problems getting up to strength. They needed at least 2,500 men to be a part of the National Guard unit in New York. So they decided, use music. See, first, we got to get folks' attention because nobody's really reading what's going on over in Germany and France. So they used the band. Jim said, I'm a lieutenant in the machine gun company. He said, no, Jim, you're the best musician in New York. You've got to put together the best regimental band in the country. So he reluctantly said he did. He said, no, I'm not in charge of the band, I'll help. So he got together with my dad, and they recruited some of the finest musicians in New York to join the National Guard. But Jim wanted a sound, and it's orchestrated. He said, I know it's a marching band, but I have orchestra ears. So he convinced them, the leaders of the colonel, whatever, if you raise $10,000 from me, I'll get you the best band you can. And he just threw that figure out, saying they're not going to do it, so I can go back to my machine gun company. They raised $10,000 and put it on James to go put together this orchestra. So once he recruited the men, because there really wasn't much pay being in the National Guard, but that $10,000 would go a long way if you joined the band. Then he goes down to Puerto Rico, where he knew some of the finest reed players were. He recruited up to 19 musicians from Puerto Rico who spoke no English. They came to New York, which they thought was the greatest thing they ever saw in their life, joined the Guard unit, and became a part of the band. And in time, Jim had one of the finest sounding orchestra, but he kept reminding everybody, I'm in the machine gun company. So to get my dad in the band, there was no such thing as a vocalist position. So they made him the drum major. That's a position of a sergeant. Then they hired another gentleman named Eugene Michael, who was a gifted musician, made him the director of the band. So now it's time for the 15th National Guard to go to train as fighting men. Where to go? Let's send them to Spartanburg, South Carolina. Now, this is all in 1917. There already are riots going on where some of the black soldiers in some of the other regiments are getting fed up with all this racism, and they go to the armory and snatch weapons. And so there's all kinds of huge incidents around the country. But they send the Harlem group to Spartanburg. And the first thing the mayor said, we don't want them here. We don't mind the other soldiers because it's a boom to the economy, but not that regiment. But they had to take them for at least 8 to 10 weeks of training. These are the fighting men, but the band goes along too. And within a couple of weeks, Jim is more interested about what's going on in New York because he left his group. He left his clef club up there, and Ubi was up there with him. So his thing was every Sunday going down to the local newspaper stand and getting any paper, he says, with the name New York on it. That'll tell me what's going on in the rest of the world. So they would go down on leave downtown Spartanburg and buy the paper. On this particular day, they asked my dad, you go get the paper this time. So my dad went into the newsstand inside of a lobby of a hotel. And when he comes in with his uniform and cap on, the first thing that happens is somebody slaps his cap off. Said, boy, take that cap off when you're inside. Well, there were some other soldiers there with their hats on. So my dad said, well, they have their hats on. He said, but you, and he called me N-word, you don't put your hat on in here. And when my dad bent over to pick up his cap, they kicked him. And then they pushed him outside onto the pavement. Well, some soldiers, white and black, who were out there saw it. it was on then. They were going to go into that and tear up this hotel, but Jim Europe was there, and being an officer, was able to stop them, call them to attention, about face, and march them back to camp. And right away, the city, the mayor, the governor asked the general, please get this group out of Spartanburg because something's going to happen. It's already started. So they shipped the entire regiment back to New York, who had been training for 2 weeks or more, what to do with them. So they sent them over to New Jersey, to Fort Dix. They sent them to another camp somewhere up near Peekskill, just to keep them busy because the division was not ready to ship. And they were one of the regiments in the division. So they didn't have an armory. There was nothing for the guys to do but mill around or go off to one of these camps. So we have an idea. Let's put them on a boat and let's head them to France. And maybe by the time they get there, we could kill some time, and then the rest of the division will follow, and then we'll have the 93rd Division. So they put them on a boat called the Pocahontas. This boat, it broke down at least twice in New York Harbor, just trying to get into the Atlantic Ocean. And so all these men and the band were on this ship. And finally, they waited till some escorts came along so they could join, and because they were still worried about German submarines and what have you. So the ship landed in France, New Year's Day, 1918. What this meant was the first African-American fighting men landed in France, but the rest of the division were still training. So let's just keep them busy. So they took their weapons from them and they turned them into stevedores. They said, well, we got a lot of unloading to do. The roads need to be built. We have some dams that need some repair. So they put the fighting men to work because the American troops were already there. General Pershing did not want those black soldiers fighting next to the white American soldiers who were already there and starting to fight. So they just kept them busy. But when the band got off the boat, the first thing they did was play the French national anthem, ragtime style. The French were sitting there amused, didn't recognize their own song until they got to the end. Right away, they snapped to attention, and so the French had never heard jazz before, much less La Marseillaise played that way. So right away, the generals and other leaders who were watching this saw how the French were reacting to the music. I mean, it was like, something happened. And so they decided, let's right away put the band on tour. Put the band on tour right now. Just send them out there to these villages and hospitals, wherever, because it looks like they bring a little happiness to the French people. So meanwhile, the fighting men are unloading ships until the French get to the point and say, we're about to lose this war. Pershing won't commit his own troops yet because he doesn't want to fight under the French banner. He wants it to be an American thing. And he doesn't want these black troops. Can we have them? So after some back and forth, they allowed the fighting men of the 15th to join a French division, but they had to take off their helmets, put on French helmets. They had to use French weapons, which they hated. And they had to almost look like Africans who were fighting with the French anyway, but not Americans. So they put them out there on the line, and oh, by the way, we're going to change their number from the 15th to the 369th. That's their new regimental number, 369th. But once those fighting men got out on the line in their sector, they started fighting in March, April. They didn't stop until armistice. They have the record of fighting 191 straight days. You get rotated back, but you come back to the front. While the other troops, the French troops, they would stop fighting for a minute, go back, I guess, have tea and whatever they do, and then come back. The 369 kept going. So in time, the French called them the men of bronze, but the Germans called them hellfighters because they never stopped fighting. They would just keep coming and coming. So they ended up as a regiment getting more honors than any other American unit before the war ended. Meanwhile, the band is introducing jazz to France. As the other regiments of the black divisions finally came over, they all brought their fine bands with them. So now France is flooded with jazz, ragtime music like they've never heard it before. But the 369th landed first, Gingrich Europe. So when it ended, they couldn't have a parade in New York. They didn't want the African American regiment to have a parade leaving New York, but the colonel promised them a parade when they got back. So the war ended in November of 1918. It took them to February of 1919 to come home because we had millions of troops over there and just a few ships. So it took a while. When they landed back in New York in February 1919, they had the biggest parade. Now, all the parades of returning troops, they'd march down Fifth Avenue to Union Square. When the 369th came back, they started at Union Square and they marched up Fifth Avenue. They made that left turn on 110th Street, made a right turn on 7th Avenue, and marched straight to Harlem. Now, you got to imagine this. You heard about black soldiers fighting over there, and you heard about the Harlem fighters doing very well, but you've never seen this before. So here comes 2,000 men marching up 7th Avenue with rifles. The music is playing. You had the heroes in the cars, and it was just, some folks said they never left. You know, the 369th, like all the other divisions, they brought soldiers in from all over America to join. If you're African American, you only have 4 choices, which regiment you're joining. So a lot of them came to New York from the South. After that parade, a lot of them never went back home because it was wild. They tell me that parade up through Harlem, when Jim Europe had the band to play "Here Comes My Daddy Now," which was a popular song then. When that band played that song, the parade stopped because the people just ran out and started grabbing, hugging men, what have you. So Jim Europe realized this is something. This is something. So when the dust settled, he decided to pull about 14 men into a band. He increased it, I think, to 30. They were all civilians at this time. This is like March, April of 1919. So with some borrowed uniforms, he decided to put a band out on the road called the Harlem Hellfighters with James Europe and Noble Sissle. So they traveled, they went on a 10-week tour. But when they broke for the tour in New York, they went into the studio and recorded 22 songs. Some of them released as 78s, they're still out there. The Harlem Hellfighters, Jim Reese Europe. And on most of the vocals, my dad is singing. There's another gentleman who sings on a couple of those sides. So they put the records out, then they returned on tour. They started in Boston and it was to end in Boston. And so in May, they returned to Boston. One of the things the mayor wanted them to do was Jim Europe to go down and put a wreath on the monument of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. This was the black regiment that fought in the Civil War. They made a movie out of it called Glory, where they made that last charge in South Carolina, and they were all killed. So the Massachusetts 54th has a very big monument up there now. And so they wanted Jim Europe to, after his last concert in Boston the next morning, put the wreath out there. So the concert goes on, it's intermission, taking a break, when one of the drummers, because they featured even in the Army and in this particular case, 2 drummers, they call them their Wright brother twins. They really weren't twins, but they looked alike. They were both out of orphanages, and so they played snare drums. So they would feature them in their concerts. But one of them was a little more high-strung, Herbert. And so during intermission, Herbert came back there and confronted Jim Europe, saying, you keep picking on me about missing some of the beats. It's not me. It's other guys. It's not me. You keep picking on me. So Jim Europe said, well, look, Herb, we'll talk about this after the concert. Just going back out. So my dad escorted him back out of the room and said, look, when the concert's over, we'll sit and talk. We'll get this straight. We can work this out. Okay, we've been through the fighting in Europe, so hey, we can work this out. Okay. So he left him, went back in, and within a few seconds, this gentleman, Wright, stormed back in, confronted Europe, pulled out a 6-inch penknife, and Jim is about 6'2", and this gentleman is like 5'4". So Jim picked up a chair like a lion tamer would, just holding them off, say, just calm down. So everybody in the room would say, calm down, calm down. But he took a swipe and he hit Jim right here, right there in the neck. And so everybody was panicking. He was bleeding. They escorted Wright out the room. They called for an ambulance and they sent Jim to the hospital. Jim said, look, finish the concert. Don't forget to go down there, Noble, and deal with the wreath at the monument tomorrow morning. I'll see you after that. Okay. So after the concert, they all went to the hospital and
I think we're frozen.
during the war, because while they were there from January to November, Jim spent most of his time fighting. He would come back to where the band was, but he was out there with his, so he became the first African-American ever in US history to lead men into combat. So when the funeral was over and the burial and everything, the promoters of this tour asked my dad, look, why don't we just take a small 12-man band back out on the road, call them the Hellfighters, but you lead it. My dad said, no, that's Jim Reese Europe. He was my mentor, and there's no way I'm going to pretend to be him and his band. So that was the end of it. So now UB is there, of course, in New York. So it was like, so what do we do now? Because Jim had all kinds of dreams and plans for Broadway, National Symphony, and getting into recording on a bigger scale. All those dreams went away. So Dad and UB said, well, it's time to go into vaudeville, I guess. But because of the experience they had with Jim and the following they already had, when they put that vaudeville act together, within 2 weeks, they were playing the Palace in tuxedos, piano and a piano bench, that's it. And they would do their songs, but they would end it with a song that Jim and my dad wrote called On Patrol in No Man's Land. When my dad performed it with the Hellfighters, the band would simulate sounds of rockets and machine guns and all this while my dad is going back and forth across the stage singing the song that Jim wrote while he was in the hospital because he got gassed over there fighting. So they would end their concerts that way. So UB and my dad would incorporate it into their routine. So their vaudeville acts that you always had to leave that stage asking for encores, although they wouldn't give it to you because there's another act coming. But they would end it with On Patrol in No Man's Land with UB making all the sounds on those 88 keys that the orchestra made with Jim Europe. So Sissle and Blake go on and they become a hit as a vaudeville act. And that pushed him further into that realm of what Jim dreamt about, going on Broadway with something more than what had been in the minstrel days.
So when does a theater project happen?
Well, that was all in 1919. So Sissle and Blake are touring. They're on the circuit of the big theaters, and they come to Philadelphia, and the NAACP was having its annual banquet there. The convention. And there was going to be a midnight show at a theater as a fundraiser. Would Sissle and Blake play there? I said, yes. So they performed for that midnight show. And on the same bill was a group called, a duo called Miller and Lyles. They were a comedy team. Jim Europe had mentioned Miller and Lyles as the kind of guys who can write a book for a musical. That was his notion that if we ever got into that, we can do the music, meaning Sissle, Blake, and Europe. And maybe those guys, Miller and Lyles, can come up with a book, script. So after this midnight show, my dad and UB approached him. He said, we knew of those guys. They've been out there for 17 years. They've even played, the West Coast. They've been out there. These guys are well known, Miller and Lyles. So after the concert, they talked with these two gentlemen and said, Jim Europe had a plan. We just didn't know what it was. So they spent the rest of the night, all night long, talking about the whole idea of how to get to Broadway with something legitimate, but something that would play not just for Black audiences, but for everyone. And we need to think of it, okay? That was 1919. In 1920, both of these guys, both of these duos are in New York. Of all of New York City, they bump into each other on the street somewhere downtown. Sissle and Blake, Miller and Lyles. And they started talking like they left off a year ago in a coffee shop about the idea of something. So one of the popular routines that Miller and Lyles had performed was a fight scene where they're fighting, but they're really talking more than fighting. But it was arguing over money. Who stole the money first? So Miller and Lyles create a book show around two guys who are both co-owners of a grocery store. And both of them are stealing out of the same cash register, right? That was the running story. Then there was a mayor's race that was coming up in the script. And one of them says, I'll run for mayor, and when I win, I'll appoint you as the chief of police. Okay, that was the gimmick. But both had to run. One run for sheriff, they started stealing again from the same cash register of their own store. So that's the running gag going on. Meanwhile, Sissle and Blake put together, Blake had about 20 songs on a shelf with no name on it already. So when the producers started looking at the idea of it, they came up with some song that would suggest what the next act was about. So Blake would go pull off one of his songs, Dad would add some lyrics, and it became one of the songs in the show. They found during their rehearsals in some old theater, somebody had left behind some old costumes that were of Oriental nature. Hey, we got some new costumes. We need a song. Sissle and Blake write a song, Oriental Blues. That would be Oriental Blues. And so the songs match the costume. So they put together the show that way. But the idea of the show having to tour somewhere and hopefully to come back to Broadway, that was a stretch. But let's at least get on the road with this thing. And they named it Shuffle Along, the music and the story. So they going from New York to Washington took them about 8 or 9 days, because you play Trenton, you play Pennsylvania, you work your way to Washington. There was very little money behind this show, first of all, much less money to put a show on the road with 20 or 30 people with very little money.
Are these producers who have never produced a show?
Oh, no. Mr. Court, who had put out several shows, they introduced this show to him. What he liked was the music. He didn't really follow along with the plot, but he loved the music. He said, that's the kind of music that we think theater goers will like. They'll leave the theater humming those songs. That's the key, it's the music. So Mr. Court put up the money, and as they got out on the road, they ran out of money because, first of all, they couldn't stay in hotels. even in New Jersey. They had to stay in private homes. But the private home would charge them $5 a night for 2 people in a room. I mean, that's the kind of budget they were on. But at one point in time, they tell the story, they were in New Jersey. It rained the night of the show, and it might have been 3 people in the theater they were playing. And so there was no ticket money to buy the ticket to the next stop. So they were on the train station figuring, well, the train going that way goes to New York. The train going that way goes to Pennsylvania. What are we going to do? We have no money anyway, but we got to figure it out. And a gentleman who was on the platform of the train station came up to him and said, "Hi, guys." He said, "Bad weather." He said, "Yes." He said, "You know what? I saw a show last night. It wasn't but me and a few other people." He said, and this is a white guy, he's saying, "You know, those Negroes, it was something. I saw that show last night." So one of the managers said, "Well, this is that show. And because there were only 3 of you in the theater, we have no money to get to the next stop." The guy said, "Wait a minute." He went to the box ticket office, came back with tickets for everybody. It turns out the guy owned part of the train, one of the train companies. And he just happened to be on the platform, and he just happened to be one of the guys seeing the show. So he gave them enough money to get to Washington, because they know if they got to Washington and played in the Howard Theater there for a week, they would be okay, have enough money to get back to New York. As they're going along, of course, you follow along with the reviews. And the reviews are kind of sketchy. Some of the reviewers don't even go see the theater, and they just say, "Hey, there was a show last night, in Philadelphia." Yeah. Not exciting news. So the producers back in New York are getting word that, we don't have anything to base this success on, because nobody is putting anything out positive, not putting out anything negative, but they're not putting out anything. So they finally get back to New York. And now, where do we go for a theater? And somebody points out there's an old, lecture hall on 63rd Street, not even a theater. It's available, and we can afford it. They go down there and look at it. There's no orchestra pit, so they had to remove a whole bunch of chairs, which, at $5 each, that's a lot of money to take out of the box and make an orchestra pit. UB Blake puts together an all-star cast of musicians, mainly because everybody needed a paycheck. But you had some of the most gifted musicians who shined during the Harlem Renaissance. But in 1921, they needed a paycheck. So the music was there, the dancing was there, and that's what excited people. They'd never seen this kind of jazz dancing and the music. But the critical thing.
How many people would be in the show? What do you think?
I would say almost 30, because you had a girls' chorus line with about 20 of them in it. And my dad was one of the characters in the show. But it was, again, about a campaign for the mayor. And when the first election didn't work out, they decided, because there was some cheating going on, so they had a re-election. And the gentleman who was really the hero of the story, his name was Harry. And his girlfriend was encouraging him to get back out there and run. Everybody likes you. Don't worry about those clowns over there at the grocery store. You're the one they need. And so the song she sang to him was "I'm Just Wild About Harry," which among the other songs in that show became the so-called hit. And so when the play opened on the 63rd Street, 3rd Street box building that turned into a theater, it became a very big hit because African Americans came downtown. They did not have to sit up in the balcony. And white patrons came. First, the way Yubi tells the story, I'd see the same gentleman in the front row of the first 3 or 4 performances. And they're listening to find out, is there any double entendre, any curse words, anything suggestive that this show might have. If not, I bring my family. So you had people coming to that show, seeing it 3 and 4 times with their family, their friends, and it was a hit. I mean, it was a hit, but it was boxed into this theater. So UB tells the story, said, now we weren't on Broadway, but it was a Broadway show because of the ticket price. Once your ticket price was over $2, that's a Broadway price. So Broadway, we're on Broadway, we're not on Broadway, but we got Broadway ticket dollars coming in. And so the show ran 500 and some odd times. It took 2-week tours. It played Boston, Chicago. It did very well. But here was the problem. Miller and Lyles write the book. Sissle and Blake write the music. It's all about sheet music then. So you get your sheet music out there, people want to buy the piano parts and go home and play it at home. So the sheet music is making money. Sissle and Blake go into the recording studio and record their songs from Shuffle Along. Not a cast album, just 78s. So the 78s and the sheet music, they're making money, not the book. So Miller and Lyles approached Sissle and Blake saying, we ought to share the royalties of the music. And before anybody could say anything, Blake said, you know what? I only had to write 3 new songs in this show. Every other song in this show I wrote before the show even was conceived. So no, we're not sharing royalties of the music. And that caused them to kind of split and go their separate ways. But in going their separate ways, Miller and Lyles went off and created another play, and Sissle and Blake went out and created another play called the Chocolate Dandies. So what you ended up having is 2 companies with more. Chocolate Dandies had over 100 people on the cast. That's why it lost money. It was about a racehorse, and they actually had a live horse on the stage on a treadmill. This is 1924. So Sissle and Blake, Miller and Lyles, they go their separate ways, but they put a whole lot of other folks at work. And so Sissle and Blake, they just went through that whole 20s and 30s as a great vaudeville and a songwriting team.
Did Miller and Lyles actually use the name Shuffle in their next show?
Oh yeah, because the term shuffle along became synonymous with the hit. And there were a whole lot of things with the word shuffle in it. Miller and Lyles, keep on shuffling. I mean, there was songs written with the term shuffle along in it. So it started something, and
But which of the 2 competing shows ran longer?
I don't know. There's a lot of literature on it because Miller and Lyles morphed into another show at the same time. So I think Chocolate Dandies lasted longer as it's on its own, but Miller and Lyles went on to shows number 3 and 4. Sissle and Blake, by this time in 1929, when the stock market crashes, that's the end of everything pretty much. So it turned out that Sissle and Blake were still widely popular in Europe of all places. They went over there once for a hot minute, but that was the place to go. So Sissle and Blake went over to London, and because Sissle had been associated with the Great War, he was well known in France too with that 369th Hellfighters band. So he had all those credentials. So it just opened up all kinds of doors in France and England. And they went over there and did very well. But UB got homesick. UB he didn't like London. He just thought it was all, he just didn't think the folks were friendly. He still has Baltimore in his mind, although he's living in New York. And so they come back to New York, and their promoters, managers said, we've got guaranteed 3 months work for you if you go back to London, play Piccadilly and all those other places. And Blake said, no, I don't want to go. So that's where Sissle and Blake had their first UB. Said, we only had one argument in all of our lives, and that was then, go or no go. So my dad said, well, okay. And he found a young piano player, and they went back to Europe and did very well. And it was just Noble Sissle. It wasn't Sissle, just Noble Sissle. Blake went back to Broadway, off Broadway, playing, because he's a piano player, so he has the opportunity to play all the time, anywhere he wanted to. So he went back to playing ragtime music, but also playing with small bands. And that's how he continued to make a living. In the meantime, my dad is over in London, and the Fred Waring Orchestra is playing in a very big hotel over there. But they were getting ready to go back to America. And the owner was looking for another American band, because that was the popular thing, to have an American band playing. And, you know, they didn't know what to do. So my dad, doing his vaudeville thing, was approached by, gosh, can't think of the name now, to say, hey, they need an orchestra. They need an American orchestra. My dad says, I have a piano player. And he said, no, you need to go to France. Paris has more African-American musicians over there who just got tired of the racism in America. They went over there and they live a happy life. You can find some of the best musicians in Paris. He did. And he went over there and found Sidney Bechet and quite a few others, put together the orchestra, came back and played to the top society in Europe as the Noble Sissle International Orchestra. So there he is, a vaudeville act morphing into an international orchestra with some of the finest musicians who could do the arrangements and the solo work and everything. And so after playing for the Toast of Society over there, a sponsor came up in America and wanted him to come back to America, play on CBS radio from the Park Central Hotel, because at that time they had live band that would play for 15 minutes, then a commercial, then another band playing. So he sailed back with his orchestra and played on CBS radio from the Park Central. But his music was kind of European, but it had a little something to it. It was like, what are they playing? It's not jazz, it's not swing music, it's something else, but it's sweet. And with the name Noble Sissle, who is he? What is he? So as his voice went out over America as the Noble Sissle Orchestra playing something real nice and soft, it was time to follow up with a tour. And that's when America found out that this is an African-American band. And so as you went on tour, you play Friday night for the African-American, Saturday for the Caucasian. And so you end up making a reputation throughout the country as a great orchestra leader. Still not playing one instrument, but he has a great orchestra. He would always sing his shuffle along medley, but he carried with him a female singer and a male singer, and they would sing the songs of the day. And somewhere in the late 30s, as he was traveling, his good old friend Miller, because Lyles had passed away in the 30s. And as a matter of fact, in the 30s, when Lyles passed away, they had a funeral for him, and Blake, Sissle, and Miller were there, and they began thinking about Shuffle Along. So how about a revival of Shuffle Along? It's 1933. So my dad is in the middle of his orchestra thing. He said, well, I'll be a part of it, but you know, I'm doing other things. So they put out Shuffle Along of 1933. I don't think it lasted 10 performances. It just didn't have it. It was old. Miller didn't change the book. And it came and went in 1933, the Shuffle Along of 33. So as my dad is traveling, Miller tells him, there's a young singer, you've got to hear this girl. She's very young. She performed in the Cotton Club, but her parents didn't like it. But she has this great voice. The next time you're in Philadelphia, I want you to meet her. And he did, and it was Lena Horne. So Lena became my dad's vocalist for about a year or two on the road. And then, but she was in love with the boy back home, and she eventually stopped and got married against her parents' wishes, had 1 or 2 children. but she recognized she got her start in that society level with the Noble Sissle Orchestra, because my dad was like grandfather to everybody. And his nickname in the band was Fess, F-E-S-S, short for professor. And so Fess maintained strong rules. And when he traveled, and it's amazing because as I have lived around the country and people recognize my name, say, oh my goodness, I remember your dad came through in 1939 and da-da-da-da. So the guys in the band who I met over the years, they say, yeah, your dad was very hard on us. He said, when we come back to this town a year from now, I don't want some lady coming backstage and saying, see this little baby? He belongs to your drummer. He said, we're not going to be that kind of band. So lights out 1 hour after the show, because they all stayed in rooming homes. You know, they didn't have hotels to go to. But the guy said, yeah, but after Fess went to bed, we still went out. You know, we still found out where the hole in the wall juke joints were. We still had our fun, but your dad didn't play that because he said, you know, we have a reputation here. We want to come back. You know, so I've heard these stories all my life in terms of how he was, but he did open the doors for a lot of people who played in his orchestra. Shuffle Along, according to Langston Hughes, pretty much kicked off the Harlem Renaissance, because after Shuffle Along was successful, there were at least 9 other African-American plays coming out through that period of time. And then anybody with talent, you go to New York because you get your book published, your poetry, you know, whatever. It was the Harlem Renaissance, and Shuffle Along pretty much kicked all that off.
Tell us how your father met your mother.
Well, my dad was married to a young lady named Harriet Toy. Her husband died. He was in the Navy. He died during World War I, but he died of pneumonia on the ship. Everybody knew him. He was a great piano player. And so my sister and I are trying to figure out, where did my dad meet Harriet? But in 1919, they had a very quiet wedding. Harriet did. And so my dad's wife, Harriet, was there during Shuffle Along, Europe, came back to the end of the 30s, but they got divorced. And it had to do pretty much with her, because my dad is very strict, never drank, never smoked either. But apparently Harriet did. And their personality just, after so many years, just clashed. So they got divorced. So my dad was a single man in the late 30s, very popular. And during that era of the Cotton Club, African Americans weren't really, you know, allowed to come as patrons. If you performed all day long, you Cab Calloway, dancers, whatever, not necessarily the people in the audience, except for celebrity African Americans like Noble Sissle, Duke Ellington, all those folks. If they happen to be in New York, you stop by the Cotton Club. Because Cotton Club, as Tom Cruise once said, is a very rich environment for the prettiest girls in New York. That's where they are. And so a lot of those guys had mistresses, wives, and everything else at the Cotton Club. And so my dad was there one night, and my mother was a Cotton Club showgirl. She wasn't a dancer. She was one of the pretty girls way in the back with the big, beautiful hats and everything. And one of her friends, they were peeking through the curtain and said, see that guy with that blue striped suit? And my mother said, you mean that old guy sitting there? I said, yes, his name is Noble Sissle. Okay, so he is very famous and he's single. So he's an old man. You need to go meet him. You need to go meet him. So nobody is filled in the blanks what happened, but they met, got married, and had 2 children, my sister and myself. She was from Miami. She was born in South Carolina. Her father was white, her mother was black, but in South Carolina, you keep the black family on that side of the town. So her father had 3 black daughters, my mother and two others. They were on that side of the town. On the other side of town, he had his other family. So his family was in construction. And when the boom came to build Miami Beach hotels, he followed the boom, but he took his 3 African-American daughters and girlfriend, the 4 of them, to Miami. So he moved them down there, left his family, the other family, back in Carolina, where they did not know about the other family. And he settled them down there in Miami. And when the bust came along of the building trade, he went back to Carolina and left them in Miami. So my mother grew up in Miami with 2 sisters and her mother. And, you know, they just made it for themselves. But somewhere along the way, all 3 girls are pretty girls. Somewhere along the way, my mother entered a beauty contest. And it was called Miss Miami. Now, this was before Miss America and everything else, called Miss Miami. So the first prize was an all-expense paid trip to New York City and a chance to get into the Cotton Club showgirl line. So the gangster who ran the beauty pageant called his gangster friend in New York saying, I'm sending up a young lady. Her name is Ethel, but we call her Sunshine. See if you can get her a spot in the show, okay? I said, sure. Mother got on a train with her little cardboard box suitcase, went to New York, found her way to the back door of the Cotton Club, introduced herself. My name is Ethel. They called me Sunshine. Just a minute. Next thing you know, she was being fitted, you know, with a costume. Well, the thing about the Cotton Club, there was a long waiting list to get in that show. If you could sing and dance, you had a chance, but there was a long line. She goes right in the back door, and next thing you know, she's in the next show. So there's hostility all around. Where do you come from? How did you get this? You can't dance, you can't sing. Well, I know somebody who made a call. So she became endeared because she just had that kind of personality. And she became a part of the Cotton Club showgirl line. And when she met my dad, my sister and I speculate, well, it's time for Noble Sissle to have some children. My mother and father were 27 years different in age. He was in his 50s, she was in her 20s. So we figured, okay, he spotted a beauty and he wanted children. Otherwise, why? Because their marriage lasted about 6 years. And the difference in age and just, you know, it'd be just too much. My mother said it was like marrying a grandfather. I had to know how to put a fork on the right side and the spoon on. He said, your dad just taught me because I didn't know anything. And so I was always being instructed on how to carry yourself. By the way, you're Mrs. Noble Sissle. That goes a long ways. So she was always under that pressure. And when World War II ended, there were millions of troops in Europe. And my dad had become a player in this new organization called the USO. So they asked him and Bill Bojangles to put together several shows because we want to send them to entertain the troops waiting to come home. So my dad, in his wisdom, put together a streamlined version of Shuffle Along as a show. And he went over there and stayed 2 years. Now, he had moved us to Los Angeles because I think his thinking was in the future, most of those guys in New York had moved to LA. So maybe that's where we need to move. So he moved us to Los Angeles. And then he went to Europe for 2 years. And that put a lot of stress and strain on my mother with these 2 babies. And she's Mrs. Noble Sissle with no J-O-B. So, you know, things just got a little rough. So when he returned, he wanted the family to move back to New York. And that was pretty much it. My mother said, no, I'm here. She'd become a socialite. It turns out she had a skill of drawing and designing. So now she's designing clothes for some of the wealthy people out there. And she says, I am not going back to Harlem from this. So she stayed in Los Angeles And they had a New York, Los Angeles divorce over the years in the late 40s. And neither of them, well, my mother remarried, but when she years later got a divorce, she moved back to New York. And my dad had lived on St. Nicholas Avenue since the mid 40s. My mother moved back to an apartment on Riverside Drive. They were like 8 blocks apart. So with my sister and I, because we were always shipped off somewhere to somebody's school, when we'd come back for holidays, summer, it was run back and forth between mom and dad. They had apartments, you know, close enough for us to walk. So that's how, you know, the rest of the 50s and 60s came about. And then my sister and I both went off to college, and, you know, that's pretty much it.
What did you do once you got to be college age?
Well, I finished college in '65. I took a 5-year plan to get out of college. And when I got out, it was Vietnam was on its way. I got out classified as 1A for the New York draft, although I'm in Florida. I went to school in Florida. And just before I graduated, I got a call that I had to go to Jacksonville for a physical. And they had the option of keeping me right there. I had 6 more hours of credits. So I had a letter from the dean saying, just give him to August so he can graduate. And they actually let me get back on the bus and come back to school. And I finished. And the first thing I did was go to New York. So it took them between August and November to find out where I was, because I always had that St. Nicholas address with my dad. And so I got my letter. I told them, okay, I'll join the Air Force in January of '66. This was December '65. And I didn't join the Air Force. So I know my days were numbered. So in April of '66, I got my greetings letter and was drafted. And my dad thought that was great because he was in World War I. His nephew was World War II. His nephew's son was in Korea. So I should be in Vietnam. And my thing was, yeah, but y'all joined. They had to come find me. Vietnam is not quite Europe, you know. But that was an ongoing argument anyway. So I got drafted, put me on a train down to South Carolina. I said, oh gosh, this sounds familiar. Here we go. So I went to South Carolina, and was just for processing. And next thing I know, I was on a plane flying to Kansas, because the 9th Infantry Division, which had fought in World War II, was being reassembled, because this is a part of President Johnson's buildup in Vietnam. So the first thing they did was reactivate the 9th Infantry Division and put them in Fort Riley, Kansas, and build the division back up from scratch. So they brought on all these non-commissioned officers and officers from around the country and the world to be in charge of the 9th Infantry. So when we got off the plane in Kansas, that was it. So it was basic training, advanced training, everything from April to December of '65. And now it's trying to deploy. So in waves of soldiers, we took a train from Kansas to Oakland, California, and we got on a boat, and we took 28 days to sail from Oakland to Vietnam. But the trick was, once you underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, you are overseas. The commitment is 12 months. That's it, 365 days. Well, the first 28 of those days was getting to Vietnam. So when we landed, all of us had our calendars. You know, we have 365 minus 28 to go. And so the 9th Infantry moved in to a half-finished camp that the 1st Infantry Division had started building. So we were there. We spent the first couple of months putting up our tents and rebuilding what we had to do. And then from that point on, we were in the south part of Vietnam. So the 9th Infantry Division mission was to protect and save the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta. We weren't up north with the Marines. We weren't on Hamburger Hill or anything like that. We were in the rice paddies protecting, because that was fed, you know, the South Vietnam population was rice. So the 9th Infantry Division was there. And, you know, a year later, I was on a plane out of there and came back to New York and say, now what do? I have a degree in accounting. I don't want to be an accountant though. So most of my adult friends were in Florida. Most of them got out of the draft. They were still down there with their family. So I took a trip in April of '68. I got out just before Tet. Didn't know what Tet was all about because the Tet holiday in 1967 was actually a holiday. There was no fighting. That was the rule for years. Tet 68, North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong changed all that. But I was in Hawaii with the plane changing when all that was going on and saying, why, those son of a gun, that was unfair. But I didn't experience Tet. And so I made my way to Florida, and I started looking at the GI Bill for graduate work and never really went back to New York. I just stayed in Florida, went to work with some consultant firms out of Washington who got federal programs to help minorities, African-American males to get into the highway construction industry. That was the most racist industry in the South, at least. All this federal money to build the interstate system, and African Americans always got the jobs to be the ones who are digging the ditch, you know, moving mud around, not on the heavy equipment. So the federal government put out contracts to help recruit people into these highly skilled positions of you know, operating multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment that the government says, if you have a multi-million-dollar contract to build part of Interstate 4 or 75, for every $1 million in your contract, you've got to prove, sign up, support, and train a qualified person to be an operator of some big piece of equipment. And so they had to, because they wanted the money. So their thing was, well, we can't find those guys. So our contract was to go to where the highway was going to be, recruit people, tell them it's going to be rough. You're going to be called in where you're not working in a group that really wants you there, but you're there for one reason, to get your skills, because you can take that same skill, go to Pennsylvania in the summer and make $40 an hour, you know, because you have a skill on a piece of equipment, certified. So I did that for a couple of years, and then as my company went into other things, I moved into other areas, but most of it was always dealing with the underserved communities. And then it became more of a Florida. I had moved to Tampa, and so it became a Tampa area thing. So I've been here since 1972.
Have you ever written a lyric or sang in front of a crowd?
When I was in the 5th grade, the little school I was in decided to form a band. So all you had to do was show up with an instrument. You didn't have to play it, just show up with the instrument. So it was a marching band of about 28 people. So I chose alto saxophone and learned it. And so I played it. In high school, we didn't have a band, but we had musicians, little small orchestras. I've always played in that. When I went off to college, I just thought I can just, with my name and my skills, I can just walk in and take a spot on one of these historically Black college marching bands. That's when I found out that I really did not know how to play the saxophone. So it's been put on the wayside since about 1961.
But you really got to know your father at the end of his life, right?
Yes. Going off to school, coming back every summer, I stayed with him. And when my mother moved to New York, my sister stayed over there because my father was living with his niece and nephew. And they were of age. They were really cousins, but I would call them uncle and aunt. He stayed with them from the 40s on. And I would spend all of my summers and Christmas holidays, whatever, with him. And during the 60s, he was very active with his band playing around New York. He played like the Order of Lafayette, you know, which was like the Park Avenue branch of the American, I don't know, whatever they were, but they had a summer dance and a winter dance. He played for them every year, plus other events. So if I was home, I'd tag along. I knew some of the musicians because they had been with him since the 30s. They all were doing other things. A lot of them working at the post office, but on the weekends, you know, they would play. So I got to know a lot of the musicians, and I'd hear their side of the stories. Because my dad really wouldn't talk too much about his story, his side. So I got to know a lot of the backstories. And when I guess it was in 1973, him living with his niece and nephew were telling me, say, you know, your dad, he really thinks he can just get back out there. He's like 83 years old, but they're retired and they can't keep up with him because he's a night owl. You know, that was his whole life, sleeping until 10 or 11 because he's going to play that night somewhere. And so his thing was 11 p.m. every night. If nothing else, he'd go down to the corner newsstand and buy tomorrow's paper in New York, you know, the Daily News or whatever. So apparently one night he did that. He came back up, and then there was a knock on the door. His niece came to the door and said, yes. He said, does Noble Sissle live here? He said, yeah. He said, well, he apparently was down at the corner and some kids jumped him, knocked him down, and took his wallet. And my aunt says, he did? He said, yes. So he called my dad. He said, Noble? So my dad came and said, yeah. He said, this gentleman said you were just robbed downstairs. And my dad said, I was? He said, yes. So the guy said, well, we got your wallet back. Here it is. So right away they called me and said, if your dad can't remember he was just mugged, it's time for him to go somewhere. So I said, my sister, she and her husband they both work in New York, but they live in New Jersey in one of those high rise. And I said, well, look, send him to Florida. In fact, I'll convince him to come to Florida. So I flew up there. First of all, we took the car keys from him years before that because he was still driving around New York, took the car from him. In fact, he donated to me because I needed it. I really didn't, but he thought it was great that he gave his son his car. But he was still catching that subway. So I convinced him he needs to come to Florida. He needs to come to Florida for a while to help get his papers together. He was always writing something. He was always trying to document something. So he would get back on he had a Royal typewriter, non-electric, and he would type. Because during the day when his niece and nephew were working, he had the house himself, and he would just write and talk and put stuff on paper. So he had 2 filing cabinets with 8 drawers total. And when I moved him, it was whatever was in those 4 drawers and 8 drawers and his clothing, because all the furniture belonged to his niece and nephew. So I moved him to Florida and kept him busy writing his papers. But basically, he would spend more time reading his papers and laughing and recalling some of those things. So as time went on, he spent about 3 years with me before he passed away. And it was great because in those 3 years, I had the luxury of working for a company that was located in Washington. So they didn't know where I was half the time. My dad and I were fishing. If there was a dinner theater going on at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd go see Mary Martin. I mean, we just hung out like we should have years ago. And it was great because I was getting married the year that he died. And it was going to be, you know, something special. But we set a wedding date in August of 75. And he got sick in June and July. So we put off, because the wedding was all about my family coming in from wherever they were. My wife-to-be's family was in Florida. So we just a matter of put it off. It wasn't going to be a big deal. Put it off and reset it for Saturday after Christmas, which was the 27th. And so my mother, who was living because she acquired some property out in California, she decided to go back out there. She said she went out there while I was in Vietnam because she just couldn't take it. So she left New York and went to California. She was living out there. And so by this time, I've got to go to work every day in 75. So my mother flew in, and she spent 2 months with my dad, just getting him to eat and getting him to talk, just keeping him active, because he would have been home alone or with some caregiver. So my mother got him to kind of turn around, sparked up. And then she told me, I came home from work, where she said, well, it's time for me to go. I said, why? You know, Thanksgiving is coming. No, your dad just recognized who I was. And with my family, the divorce never ended, right? There was always some lingering argument, especially over the children. And your dad's doing well now because he just realized his caregiver was his ex-wife. And she said, I think I'll go. I think he's fine. And it looked like he had a little spark of, you know, rejuvenation. This was like September, October. So the wedding was on. Everybody's getting ready to come back to Florida. And then in December, he just took a turn for the worse. And he passed away at home with me just sitting next to him because, you know, it was like, call the hospital, call the doctor, the nurses. I said, you know, he needs to move to a home where he can get more care. And I said, no, he's fine right here. I mean, he had all the doctors and nurses coming. So he and I were sitting together when he took his last breath. And that was December 17th, 1965. Well, he had always told us he's going to be buried at a national cemetery in Long Island. Wherever his body is, that's where he is going. So that's what we prepared for. So we shipped him up there, and they had at St. Mark's Church, it was a cold day, it was a December 22nd, very cold day at his church, but it was filled. I mean, his band was there, Yubi was there, they played, Cab Calloway, a lot of the folks who were from that era that happened to be in New York and could come out on that cold day, politicians, everybody, they came to the church and gave him a great send-off. But what really made that ceremony better, because it was all scripted. I gave the eulogy and what have you. It was a lady who stood up and apologized to interrupt, but she just wanted to say, I knew Noble Sissle, he didn't know me. I lived in the same block, but every time I saw him, he spoke to me like he knew me. That's who that man was. And I couldn't have said that. Somebody else had to say that, but that was him. He was just, you could approach him. I mean, he was just that kind of person. So we buried him at the Long Island National Cemetery, and I flew to Florida and got married. So those 3 years, 2.5 years were great. It was like it was like the old show Sanford and Son. I had to tell him what to do, and he did not like that. And who am I to tell him we've got to do this? We got to stop doing that. Who am I? So I was having your son. He said, that's right. And I'm the father. I said, but Dad, we got to do this or that. So the only way that I tell my family, everybody, the only way I got my father to kind of calm down, because he had this sense of humor that goes back way beyond. I mean, he always knew how to use a sense of humor to get out of a difficult situation. And I would use this on him. Every time he gets steamed up and tell me, I can't tell him, Dad, how about some ice cream? And he would always say, you know, I don't mind if I do. And that would end whatever was going on. That's how it ended. And we go have some ice cream. So I always kept a half gallon of vanilla ice cream around just in case. So, because that was his nature. And so those 2.5, 3 years were great, you know. So I knew early that he was a great man. I didn't know how great until you start taking courses in history and theater and whatever, and you start going to the index of the book and you see his name with all the credits, and he said this, he did this. And I knew of it, but now it's in writing. And so as my two sons grew up and went to college, I said, just when you get into those kind of courses, go to the index and see what Grandpa did. Because if the subject is on Harlem Renaissance, he's always through that. But look before that, look World War I. That's the key. That's where he got his start. And Jim York is the man who made it all happen.
Well, it's been fascinating to talk with you. I'm sure we could talk more, maybe well down the line, but I thank you for spending an hour and 15 minutes or so with us.
Has it been that long? Has it been that long? Bruce, let me just make another point here. Back in 2016, as America was approaching, the world was approaching the centennial of the end of World War I, we saw there was a national commission getting ready to do some great things leading up to the armistice signing in 2018. And so a couple of us approached the Centennial Commission that had lots of money, that we wanted to reconstruct the Harlem Hellfighters Band with African-American students who attend historically Black colleges. It took a while, and they finally gave us some seed money, and we went and recruited online about 42 musicians. We came up with the music of the day, which is mostly W.C. Handy music from World War I. And they sent for us to come to New York for in 2018 for Fleet Week. And we showed up, we played on the deck of the Intrepid aircraft carrier museum that's there. And it went over so well that they brought us back to DC in 2018 for the armistice signing. They unveiled a new monument that's going up about World War I at the Pershing Park. We played there. They brought us back. So our little band of 42 musicians played about 4 times, twice in New York and 3 times in New York and once in DC. And our promise to the guys in the band was that they know the history. We're going to try to get this band to Europe, to France, to go on that same tour. France wants us. Nobody's sending us. So it looked like this was the year to go, and then COVID-19 ends all of that. So we're hoping next year those musicians will come back together and we'll go on tour to recreate the Harlem Hellfighters. But we call our group the 369th Experience. And if you go to YouTube, or any of your followers go to YouTube and go to 369th Experience Band, you'll see a number of our performances from the Kennedy Center to, we were at the African American Museum there, and a few other places we played. They're all on YouTube. 369th Experience Band.
Well, that's just great. So, and I hope we can continue conversing off camera, and
yes,
I can
please
keep in touch
do.
with you. And if they
Please
do that,
do.
I would say maybe we can do another program when that happens, talking about it.
Okay.
Very good.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.